Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is the Intel Core i7-5775C, a short-lived and often forgotten CPU from the days of socket 1150. As expected from this era of i7s, the 5775C has 4 cores, 8 threads and is unlocked for overclocking. What makes this unique, however, is its 128MB of embedded DRAM and inclusion of Iris Pro 6200 graphics. When paired with a discrete graphics card, the EDRAM essentially acts as a massive L4 cache, which will no doubt improve performance in certain games and applications. For those who want to take advantage of the integrated graphics, the fastest any desktop CPU had to offer at the time, the EDRAM helps alleviate bandwidth issues caused by slower shared DDR3 system memory, which typically bottlenecks iGPUs. This CPU sounds pretty cool on paper, right? But the 5775C's pre-Skylake launch window, high launch price and scarce supply meant it was somewhat overlooked back in 2015. Anyone with over $300 to spend on a processor at the time was likely holding out for Intel's 6th generation instead, and the new DDR4 memory platform. These days, it's still harder to find one of these than it is the 4790K, a legendary chip that is plentiful on the used market, and the 5775C here continues to command a higher price tag. The exclusive compatibility with H97 or Z97 boards doesn't help with system costs either, and it makes it an even harder sell, especially when this platform is considered long obsolete by most. This is very much an enthusiast's CPU in 2026, just as it was more than a decade ago. But let's see what it can do these days. How does it stack up against the legendary 4790K all these years later? Well, I'll be running both chips at stock settings today with an Asus Griffin Z97 board. Now a quick word on overclocking. The 5775C here wasn't a particularly decent overclocker, often hitting a ceiling at around 4.1-4.2 GHz, perhaps due to architectural constraints of this early 14 nanometer manufacturing process, and the integration of the EDRAM. It sounds like this also hits a bit of a voltage wall as well. Now in terms of my chip, I couldn't get it to budge. It wouldn't boot if I touched the clock speed, which is a bit of a shame, but we will be looking into this and perhaps revisiting this chip a little later on in the week, where we'll just overclock everything, the frequency, the iGPU and the EDRAM portion of the chip, if we can, to see how it holds up when we squeeze the absolute most out of it. But first I've got to figure out why it doesn't want to budge. Now the 5775C will boost to a lower all-core speed than the 4790K. We're looking at 3.6 GHz as opposed to 4.2. So what difference does this actually make when compared to the 4790K? And can the EDRAM, in this case acting as L4 cache, actually help close the gap, or perhaps make this 5775C outperform the well-known and far more common choice? So in GTA 5 Legacy at 1080p with the highest settings and FXAA, this is the original version of the game. Reason being is that I didn't have enough space on my SSD for this and the enhanced edition, and I wanted to test it with the integrated graphics later on as well. So with the 5775C, 32 gigs of DDR3 clocked at 1866 MHz and an RTX 4070 Super at 1080p, we saw a very nice 69 FPS from this forgotten Intel chip. The percentile loads were pretty good as well, 48 and 42. When compared to the 4790K, which of course boosts to a higher all-core clock, well, we saw 1 FPS less. The 4790K pulled ahead with 70 frames per second, within margin of error territory here, and the percentile lows were better with the 4th gen part as well, 50 and 43 up from 48 and 42. So a very slight difference, and one that's only really noticeable when measuring this performance using tools like MSI Afterburner. In Counter-Strike 2 at 1080p with the high preset and MSAA off, we saw 153 frames per second from the 5775C, a 1% low of 70 and a 0.1% low of 49. This is a noticeable improvement over the 4790K, which hit 142 FPS, though the percentile lows weren't all that different with 66 and 53. In fact, that 0.1% low with the 4th gen part was actually slightly higher, but the game did feel slightly better to play on the rarer 5th gen chip. Perhaps thanks to that 128MB of EDRAM here. Cyberpunk 2077 is notoriously CPU demanding, especially when it comes to older processors here, and if you're trying to play on a quad-core 8-thread chip, well, you may see a few issues. That said, you can get away with it with newer i3 parts from the 12th gen and higher, but with older chips like this, you may notice a few stutters and frame drops. That said, the 5775C hits 60 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 38 and a 0.1% low of 34. Performance does leave a little to be desired. The same average was achieved with the 4790K, 60 frames per second, the 1% low was 37 and the 0.1% low was 32. So a slight drop in those percentile numbers with the more common 4th gen chip. Crimson Desert is also pretty CPU demanding, and as such it struggled on both as expected. Both of these, while solid gaming choices back in the day, will struggle in most modern titles, so that is worth bearing in mind. The 5775C hit 52 FPS with a 1% low of 33 and a 0.1% low of 30, and it struggled particularly in and around busier areas like you're seeing on screen here. The 4790K with its stock clock speeds hit 49 FPS, a 1% low of 31 and a 0.1% low of 27, so slightly better for the 5775C and its lower all-core clock speeds here. The 5775C will also use less power and run cooler, so my aftermarket heatsink fan was certainly a lot quieter when paired with this 5th gen chip. Forza Horizon 6, the newest game tested today with the Ultra preset and TAA, hit a very respectable 79 FPS on the 5775C, a 1% low of 56 and a 0.1% low of 48. This game offers surprising performance on older hardware like this. This was actually an improvement from the 4790K, which scored 74 FPS on average, a 1% low of 53 and a 0.1% low of 47, so figures with the newer 5th gen part were improved across the board. We'll finalise with Red Dead Redemption 2 now at 1080p with the ultra textures, everything else set to high, including TAA. With the 5775C we saw 68 frames per second. This was actually 1 FPS lower than the 4790K's 69 frames per second, but where we saw the biggest improvement here wasn't with the 1% low, which was slightly less, yet again 51 compared to 53, but it was with the 0.1% figure. In fact, Red Dead Redemption 2 felt a little smoother to play, especially as we approached those busier areas with lots of NPCs going about their daily business, such as Valentine here. We're looking at 46 frames per second for the 5775C, but the 0.1% low on the 4790K came in at just 39. I say just, it still felt pretty smooth considering this is a pretty old quad-core 8-thread CPU, but the improvement to the smoothness overall was certainly noticeable with the 5th gen chip. There were less sort of micro stutters as we made our way through the town. Pretty interesting final result here. Of course, we need to mention the integrated graphics because the 5775C features Iris Pro 6200. Now, just like the HD 4600 found on the 4790K, these are pretty obsolete. I think most would say the drivers haven't been updated in years, but hopefully we can still get a decent idea of any performance differences, and we'll start our iGPU benchmarks today with Counter-Strike 2. Now I do plan to publish a longer Iris Pro video to see how this holds up in a wider range of titles and whether or not we can even run them, but I've selected a few games that are best suited to this hardware today. So with CS2 720p in the lowest settings, we're looking at 47 FPS with a 1% low of 35 and a 0.1% low of 32. The HD 4600 graphics on the 4790K managed just 28 frames per second, again with far inferior percentile lows as well. So there is a noticeable difference with the Iris Pro graphics here, and this is an area whereby the 5775C really shines in terms of its advantages over the 4790K. In GTA 5 Legacy, again we're looking at a pretty solid improvement. We're up to 58 frames per second from 35 with the HD 4600. The percentile lows were also up from 27 and 25 to 45 and 40 respectively, so a lot smoother with the Iris Pro graphics as expected from the 5775C, which has that large 128 megabyte EDRAM integrated right into it. For Skyrim Special Edition, we're looking at 720p once again with the low preset. 720p low is basically the place to be with these old school integrated graphics. 64 FPS was achieved by the 5775C here. The 1% low was 55 and the 0.1% low was 46. I actually removed the frame rate cap and it did make things feel a little less smooth. The frame time graph wasn't as consistent, but I did this in order to show you the real difference between the two chips, and performance here was basically, well, nearly double than it was with the 4790K and HD 4600, which managed just 34 FPS. Still a playable result if you're desperate, but the Iris Pro pulled way ahead. So in terms of integrated graphics, this is an area where the 5775C really shines. Now, I mentioned problems with overclocking, and this is something we'll look into at another time, but I also want to mention the inconvenience of the 5775C, particularly if you have a lower end motherboard. See, this will only work with H97 and Z97 boards because of unique hardware and firmware requirements. For example, because of the EDRAM, this requires an extra voltage rail, which older 8 series boards will lack. So you need a pretty decent board in order to run this chip, and you also have to make sure that you update it to the latest BIOS. So you might even need an older 4th gen chip as well to actually update it to the latest BIOS and get it to run this thing. Now, Z97 boards may not be that expensive these days, at least compared to when they were new, but considering you could just get a 4790K and a cheap board, or standard 4790 if you wanted to, slap it together for a reasonable budget and it would work straight away, that sounds a lot more tempting than looking for a 5775C, which is going to be more expensive to start with, and then looking for a higher end board. But I just wanted to check this out because I just think it's a pretty interesting chip. And you can also buy an i5 5675C, I believe it's called, but that will have 4 cores and 4 threads, as was traditional with i5s of that era, so that is going to struggle even more, especially without hyper-threading. Anyway, this isn't the last you're going to see of the 5775C. We're going to work out why it's not overclocking at the moment, and then we're also going to test the integrated graphics again, but with a wider range of games, just to see how they are holding up. But I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to the 5775C. Let me know your thoughts down below. Let me know if you ever owned one of these, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.